Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm from Germany. I do not have any jokes. Sorry about that. um, there are a couple of things that I have experience with, but the thing that I have most experience with is being a Sebastian. So maybe that was a joke, I don't know. Like Susanna already mentioned, I do things with computers for quite some time now. I started doing that when I was 12 years old on an Amiga 500 back in 1990, and I got quickly bored of just consuming things passively on a thing, and I wanted to control the machine and learned programming, assembly language, C, AREX, and other languages. At some point in 1998, I put the Amiga in the attic. It would take a couple of decades until I got it out from there again, but in 1998 I got a PC. I started going to university and I came across PHP. So since 1998 I've been using PHP. That was PHP 3.0.10 something. And I quickly got involved in a PHP project by asking questions on the mailing list, answering questions, contributing to the documentation, finding bugs in PHP, fixing bugs, and then supported other people in the design of what would later become PHP 5. And around the same time, I started to do open source, to live and breathe open source, to love open source, to embrace open source. It's very important to me. It's a very important part of my life. And in 2000, so 23 years ago, which is another way of saying that I'm old, not just I do retro computing, but I've been doing this for quite some time, I started to work on PHPUnit. And together with Arne, who's also here, and Stefan, who is not here, in 2009, I founded a PHP consulting company, and we are proud to sponsor events like this one. So, PHPUnit 10 is the topic of this presentation. And I would have loved to talk about PHPUnit 10 2 years ago, which is when it was supposed to come out. But there was this thing called the pandemic, and things didn't go according to plan. And last year, I gave a presentation entirely about why PHPUnit 10 was delayed for 2 years. I'm not going to bore you with those details. There's a URL in the slides that points to a presentation where there's a video recording. If you want to have some insight into behind the scenes of an open source project, what kind of impact the pandemic had on the lives of people working on open source. So TLDR, it's 2 years late, sorry. It had to do on the one hand with the pandemic, on the other hand, we had underestimated the amount of work that it would take to support some of the new features of PHP 8 in things like PHPUnit's test double system. So where is George? There he is. I really like George. George is one of the PHP core developers that is funded by the PHP Foundation. But as much as I like him, he's responsible for some things, some new features in the language that caused me quite a headache, like DNF types and other types. And intersection types and union types also did not help making it easy to support new features in new PHP 8 features in PHPUnit. So that took longer than expected, which was time that we did not have to work on PHPUnit 10. And then around the same time, we also decided to change the support model of PHPUnit with regards to the versions of PHP that a version of PHPUnit supports. So suddenly we had to backport a lot of work from PHPUnit 9 to PHPUnit 8, make PHPUnit 8 compatible with PHP 7.3, 7.4, 8.0, and by the time we were finally done, 8.1. So that obviously did not help to speed up the development of PHPUnit 10, and then at some point, we had finally the major thing of PHPUnit 10 ready, which is PHPUnit's event system, which is something that you as end users of PHPUnit usually won't get to see. This is something that was built to help, on the one hand, the people working on PHPUnit itself, and on the other hand, to people like Filippo and Alessandro and others who build extensions for PHPUnit and wrappers around PHPUnit's test runner to do things like custom reporting, parallel test execution, and so on. So that was the focus of PHPUnit 10. But once we had the event system in place, we realized there's now a really good opportunity to clean up more stuff. Can we just clean up this one thing over here now that we have a nice event system? And oh look, now that I have cleaned that up, this other thing now became clean upable, if that is a term, I don't know. So after cleaning up one thing and cleaning up another thing, well, it's on and on it went. And then at some point we just decided, okay, this is now good enough, this has to be good enough, we need to release this. So PHPUnit 10.0 was released at the beginning of February, earlier this year. And that was a day where I was very, very nervous, because every time you do something that you do not do on a regular basis or in short periods of time, it's something that you might get scared of. And like PHPUnit for a very long time already had this annual release rhythm of a new major version on the first Friday of February that basically removes stuff, breaks stuff, and lays the foundation for new features that are released throughout the year. So usually a release like 10.1, 10.2, 10.3 and so on will be the releases with big new features. So I just mentioned it's 2 years late, so it has been a while since I made a new major release, so I was scared of what might happen. It turned out that the release went rather well, considering that it is such a massive refactoring and in some parts even a rewrite under the hood. And Andre already talked about yesterday that he does not think that release candidates and beta versions are really as beneficial as most people assume. And I totally agree, which is why I stopped, like, I don't know, 10 plus years ago to release beta versions and release candidates of PHPUnit. People are free to use the nightly builds of the next minor or the next major version to see whether that works for them, but I do not roll releases for that. So I just at the morning, just right after breakfast on February 3rd, I released PHPUnit 10.0.0. And then, where is he? There he is, Marco. So I announced the release on Mastodon, and shortly thereafter, Marco replied, nice, I go update all the PHPUnit versions in all of my packages. And I told him, Marco, please read the paragraph under, oh my God, what the fuck, barbecue, I must upgrade to PHPUnit 10 immediately. No, you do not. In the release announcement before you do that. And his reply I did not include in the screenshot. It basically said, yeah, I ignore that, I just do that and whatever. So the point of this being, just because there is a new version, or especially a new major version of something like PHPUnit, does not mean that you must upgrade to it immediately. It does not mean that the version that you are using right now suddenly stops working. It hopefully does not, and it didn't, right? So take your time to at least read the release announcement and see what are the potential backwards compatibility issues that you might run into when you upgrade to the new major version. Make it a conscious decision to upgrade a major thing like a tool or a dependency in your software project before you actually do that. And I was very happy because soon after the release, people like Filippo reached out and said, hey, Paratest version 7 has been released, works with PHPUnit 10. Same was true a little while later for ParaUnit. I already knew from the Laravel community that their custom result printer for PHPUnit, as well as PEST, which wraps around PHPUnit and builds on top of PHPUnit for their testing efforts, was compatible with PHPUnit 10, but they decided to delay the release of that until the Laracon event where the new Laravel version was released, and other tools that work with PHPUnit or build on top of PHPUnit, like Infection, also within the first 1 or 2 weeks released versions that are compatible with PHPUnit 10. So that was great. And something that I did not anticipate at all, and at some point I want to find the time to look into this, because while we were working on PHPUnit 10, we did not really focus on any performance improvements. And I suspected maybe some things will be quicker in the new version because we got rid of a lot of really old, ugly code that nobody, me included, understands anymore. But I was really surprised when Filippo told me that for him, PHPUnit 10.07 was noticeably faster compared to PHPUnit 9.6. It's not 2 or 3 times faster. That was a performance regression that we fixed in 10.07. But yeah, the first couple of days were quite hectic and not really stressful, but there was lots of work to do, and I had allotted time for that. I did not do any customer engagements during those days. I just focused on open source work. And you can see that how quickly bug fix releases for 10.0 came out, and it slowed down after about a week and fell into a weekly rhythm. Yeah, okay, only minor issues are fixed. There's nothing that I need to immediately push out. Okay. So let's talk about some new features. It's rather unusual, like I mentioned earlier, for a new major version of PHPUnit to actually bring big new features, because usually the first release of the year is just, okay, remove everything that was deprecated in the previous major version and make breaking changes to help the developers that work on PHPUnit sane in the long run, because the less code that we need to work with, like some features inside a project like PHPUnit that has been going on for now over 2 decades, and now I make myself feel old, yes, sorry. Some features that were relevant and important 20 years ago, they are not important or applicable today with today's PHP versions. Workarounds that were needed for a PHP version that was relevant 10 years ago are no longer needed. So we need to constantly clean up the mess, remove stuff that is no longer needed, because every line of code that you have in a project like that is a liability. It's a line of code where something can go wrong. It's a line of code that needs to be adapted to the next PHP version, that needs to be considered when you implement a new feature. And if you do not remove stuff that is no longer relevant and no longer needed, if it causes more, if it's more of a burden than it actually helps you, then it needs to be removed. But since PHPUnit 10 took so long in its development, we actually had the time along the way to add support for some new features. So when PHP 8 came out, PHP got support for what is called attributes, what in other languages is referred to as annotations. What we in the PHP world do not refer to annotations, because for the last 20 plus years, we referred to weird strings with an @ inside a doc block comment as annotations. So we decided to call them attributes, and that is metadata. That is additional information that you can put at units of code in your source code. So you can add additional information to classes, properties, methods, parameters, and so on. And this is a much better way of doing that than the old-fashioned way. So the old-fashioned way looked like this. You had, for instance, a test class named colorTest that extends PHPUnit framework test case, and you wanted to put additional information to that test case class that PHPUnit hopefully does something useful with. So in the past, you only had the option of using a doc comment, which is a special type of comment right in front of the code unit that starts with /**. And if I had a penny or a cent for every time over the last 20 years or so somebody opened a ticket, yeah, this annotation that I saw in the PHPUnit documentation does not work, it has no effect, please fix this. And the result was that they wrote /* and not /**. Well, then we wouldn't need to have a talk about open source funding and things like that. So it is a very error-prone approach because it's not part of the syntax, it's just a comment. And it's up to the developer of a tool, such as PHPUnit, for instance, to make sense out of that, what is basically just a string. So in this case, this test case class says, hey, I am interested in the unit of code Sebastian Bergmann ray tracer color. So that means while the tests from this test case class are running, please only collect code coverage information for the thing I'm interested in. And the other thing on line 7 says, I consider this test to be small. This is supposed to be a unit test. So some special rules behind the scenes apply, like there's a time limit for this test, and code coverage generated by this test is shown, displayed in the HTML code coverage report with a darker shade of green because a small test has run it and not a big test that may have accidentally run that line of code without actually verifying that it works correctly. And there are plenty of things that can go wrong with these annotations. You could have a typo in there. A couple of years ago, I was at a PHP conference in Canada, and there was a keynote from someone that said, well, we had a security issue on our site because we are using Symfony and we're using the annotations for access control. Like, here is a page and you have to be logged in and you have to be a user of a specific level to access this page, and we denoted all of that in annotations. And they had a typo in their annotation, so Symfony did not pick that up, so everyone could access that page, which is not what you want to have. Since then, I believe that Symfony has tooling in place to look for things like that, but a lot of things can go wrong when you're only dealing with strings. So I'm so happy that PHP 8 introduced attributes, which is metadata for code units in code. So the code that you see here semantically does exactly the same as the code that I showed you on the previous slide, but now this metadata is written down in code. So PHP can verify this information. You cannot use an attribute that does not exist. Yeah, and all these attributes, they know where they are allowed to be used. So covers class is an attribute that can only be used on the class level. If you try to use it on the method level, boom, right? And you get autocomplete for that. And things like fully qualified class names in code comments are no longer a thing, because this is syntax, and this is syntax where you can use local names, like in line, yeah, I don't know, line 7, I say, hey, I'm interested in color : class, and I can use the special class constant that contains the fully qualified class name, because this is real code, this is real syntax. Before, I would have to manually write the fully qualified class name, and it's not syntax, it's not automatically changed when you refactor things, it's a mess, it's error prone, and I hope that we can eventually get rid of that. I'm yet undecided if I want to deprecate annotations and at some point remove it. I mean, the code is there, it works. Well, it works since Marco refactored it a couple of years ago. and added a lot of tests for that mess. So it's contained, it works, but it's not going to be extended. New metadata that I add to PHPUnit will only be implemented as attributes. I will not go back and add new annotations because I do not want to touch that ever again. So I hope that over time, less and less teams will use annotations so that I can eventually remove it. That was unexpected. At some point, I realized, oh, all these changes that we made to PHPUnit 10, they need to be reflected in the documentation. So I just need to update the documentation. And then I realized, oh, there's a lot of more work hiding here, or more work that should be done. So I ended up almost completely rewriting the documentation over the course of 2 or 3 weekends. So I think that the documentation is now in a much better place than it used to be before, especially the first chapter on installing and updating PHPUnit and going from one version to another, or installing PHPUnit for the first time in your project. It's also very, very verbose now how you should not install PHPUnit. Yeah, and because that was an issue a couple of weeks ago, please note that only the documentation on docs.phpunit.de is the official documentation. I cannot prevent somebody to take the GitHub repository for the documentation, render the documentation, and publish it somewhere else. I started recently to get bug reports from people like the documentation is outdated, PHPUnit 10 is the current version, but there's only documentation for PHPUnit 8, and it's wrong, and whatever. And yeah, I cannot do anything about that. Only docs.phpunit.de is the official documentation. If you find a problem there, please report it and we will fix it. I cannot fix outdated forks somewhere on websites that I do not own. And now for something completely different and unexpected that I really did not expect that I would ever have to talk in detail about. So one of the nice things, or one of the interesting things that happened when we introduced the event system. So PHPUnit 10 has now an event system. Everything that happens inside of PHPUnit triggers an event that extensions can subscribe to, and PHPUnit's own output subscribes to those events and handles the events and uses events for everything internally. So PHPUnit, the test runner started, PHPUnit read the configuration file, and here's a canonical representation of what the configuration is for the current test run. All the tests have been loaded, the tests have been filtered and sorted, and these are the tests that we are about to run in this order. Test execution has started, test execution has failed. All of those things are events. And there are also events for things that go wrong. And that allowed us to change something that has bothered me for quite some time. And it did not only bother me, it bothered people like Marco, like Larry, like others. So I'm quoting Larry here. Some systems are configured to treat all deprecations as errors. These systems are doing it wrong, period. They are inventing problems that do not exist, and the fault lies not with the PHP team, but with the people who configure their systems wrong. The background of that is that every year when a new PHP version is released, there is the same, if I want to use a nice term, discussion going on from people. Oh, I upgraded to the new version of PHP and now I get 100, 200, a million new deprecation warnings, and this gets in the way, so I do not upgrade. Because people misunderstand a deprecation as something that you need to immediately act upon. Yes, it would be nice if you could immediately act upon, but you do not have to do that. It's not an error yet. It's a notice that you are given that the code as it is right now will stop working as it works right now when you go to the next major version. That is the information that we try to convey there from PHP. But since PHPUnit for the longest time by default interpreted deprecations from PHP as an error, well, we'll get back to that. So I stopped doing that. So in September of 2021, I released PHPUnit 8.5.21 and 9.5.10. Basically, PHPUnit no longer converts PHP deprecations to exceptions by default. PHPUnit 8, PHPUnit 9 did not have the event system. So there, these deprecations had to be converted into exceptions so that we could report them. But that had the side effect that when, that had the side effect of I lost my train of thought. So that had the side effect of you're executing a piece of code from a test, and that piece of code triggers an eDeprecated. That eDeprecated is converted by the custom error handler to an exception, and at that point in time, the execution of the test is aborted, and you do not know whether the test would have succeeded or whether it would have failed, because the first deprecation or notice or warning that comes from PHP says, hey, I'm out, this is broken, fix this. And I understand that this caused a lot of frustration, and the first step into making it better was with no longer doing that by default. So people could opt in to this very German strict mode of interpreting deprecations. So PHPUnit used to also treat deprecations as test failures by default. It no longer does. It never should have, but it doesn't anymore, so that's no longer an excuse. So that was good. So if we look back at PHPUnit 9 and before, PHPUnit only had the concept of the outcome of a test. You would run a test, and then you would have one of these outcome situations. Best case scenario, the test passed. Great, we can move on, everything is green, awesome. The test errored, there was an unexpected exception, there was an error somewhere, test could have failed, an assertion failed, there could be a warning, and the warning could come from PHPUnit itself. Hey, you're using a feature that is deprecated, next version of PHPUnit will no longer have that, please update your test code. Or it could be an e-warning or an e-user warning triggered by trigger error, for instance. You didn't really know. The test could be considered risky. Hey, the test passed, but you did not perform any assertion. Are you sure that this test is really useful? Probably not. Test could be marked as incomplete, which is what some people sometimes like to do. Okay, I start working on a test. I come to a point, until that point everything already passes and works, but I know that this test is not complete yet, so I can put this mark test incomplete into the test code, and PHPUnit will tell me, hey, this test is not done yet. Here you have a to-do item that you can come back to later. But if there is a failure or an error before we hit the mark test incomplete, PHPUnit will of course report that. And the test can be skipped, for instance, because the requirements are not met. Test can say, hey, I require to be run on Windows. I'm running the test currently on Linux. Okay, so I need to skip that test because the prerequisites are not met. And all of these things were on the same level because PHPUnit 9 and earlier only had outcome. PHPUnit 10 added the concept of issues to the concept of outcome. So now we have only as outcome passed, errored, failed, incomplete, and skipped. But there are a lot of issues that can occur while running a test. And all of these issues can occur whether or not the test passed or failed or errored. So you can have a test that is successful, but it triggered a PHPUnit warning because something was wrong. It could be that a PHPUnit deprecation is triggered. Hey, you're using a feature that is going away, change it. Could be that you're using code that will break in the next version of PHP because a PHP deprecation has been triggered. Or you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing and an e-strict or an e-notice was emitted for that. And PHPUnit keeps those things completely separate. And for quite some time, I thought that this would be good enough, but boy, was I wrong. So let's start at the beginning. Error handling. As of PHPUnit 10.0, all these e_user or just e_ things are no longer treated as errors. PHPUnit will no longer abort the execution of a test just because there was an e-deprecated or an e-user deprecated happening along the way. What does that look like with an example? Very small project, don't expect anything fancy. We have an SRC directory, we have a test directory, we have a vendor directory, we have a source class, we have a test class for our source class, and we have a vendor class. In our source class test, we just create a new object of source class called do something, and that's the only thing that we're interested in here for the purpose of this topic. In our source class, we use the PHP function trigger error to emit an e-user deprecated, an e-user notice, and an e-user warning, and then we call code that is not our own code that we probably installed using Composer from packages. It's code in our vendor directory, it's third-party code, and we call do something on the third-party code. And the third-party code looks very similar. We trigger an e-user deprecated, an e-user notice, and an e-user warning. When we run this test with PHPUnit 9, we get an error. There was one error. Source class test something, deprecation, source class.php line 10. Source class PHP line 10, that's that line, trigger error, deprecation, e-user deprecated. So PHPUnit 9 hits the line with the trigger error. That trigger error causes the e-user deprecated. PHPUnit's error handler acts upon the e-user deprecated, turns that into an exception. The exception is thrown. Throwing the exception aborts the execution of the test method. And the only thing we know is, hey, there was an error. This is the frustrating thing that Larry described in his blog post that I mentioned earlier. So this is not what we want. And this, by the way, annoyed me for quite some time, like at least, I don't know, 10 years or so, but I never had a means of properly addressing that. So this is what the same test looks like, or running the same test looks like with PHPUnit 10. The test succeeds. We reach the end of the test method just because there is a e-user deprecated. The execution of the test method is not aborted. We reach the end. PHPUnit tells us, hey, okay, the test succeeded, but there are issues. Remember, outcome versus issues. So we see in the summary, we ran one test, there was one assertion, we had one warning, one deprecation, one notice. This is not really the amount of warnings, deprecations, and notices. This is rather the amount of tests that triggered a warning, the amount of tests that triggered a deprecation, and the amount of tests that triggered a notice. I am not yet happy with the way that this is presented. For PHPUnit 10.2 or PHPUnit 10.3, more likely, I plan to implement better reporting for that is more intuitive. So this is what it looks like right now if you call PHPUnit's test runner with display deprecations. So by default, details for deprecations and other things like that are not printed. And you see, okay, one test triggered two deprecations. This is the first deprecation that was triggered in source class.php. This is the second deprecation that was triggered in vendor class.php. And For a couple of weeks, or a couple of months even, I was fairly happy with that and said, hey, this would finally make everyone happy. And then we released it, and then almost immediately after we released PHPUnit 10.0, people came along and said, hey, it's nice that you're no longer treating the deprecations as errors and that the test is no longer aborted, but I get so much noise from those third-party libraries that I use, and I cannot do anything about that, and it's really frustrating to every time I run my tests, I'm getting pointed at problems that I cannot solve because it's not my code. Okay, so same for notices and warnings. So we addressed that in PHPUnit 10.1, which was released last month. Almost on schedule this time. I forgot that on the first Friday of April this year I would be on vacation, so I had to push the release by 1 week. So as of PHPUnit 10.1, the reporting of e_things can be restricted to your code. So in your XML configuration file for PHPUnit, you can tell, hey, this is the code that I'm interested in. This is basically the evolution of the code coverage include list that you probably already had for quite some time. It's relatively easy to migrate to that, and the important thing here is we say, hey, this is the code I'm interested in. This is my code. And this information is currently used for two things. It's used for, this is the code that I'm interested in for code coverage reporting. And this is the code I'm interested in when it comes to deprecations, notices, and warnings. You can say, hey, restrict deprecations to my code. And then we run the tests. We only see the deprecation for our own code. The deprecation that is in vendor is ignored. And this now allows developers to focus on what they can address. And again, history repeating, for a couple of weeks, I was fairly confident that this would be good enough, but it wasn't. Yeah, it also works for notices, and it also works for warnings. Okay, that was to be expected. So PHPUnit 10.2, which will be released a couple of weeks from now, at the start of June. As of PHPUnit 10.2, the suppression of e-user thingies and e-deprecated and so on can be ignored. So what does that mean? There are a couple of big, well-known, popular open source projects that use this pattern to mark methods as deprecated. Symfony does that, Typo3 does that, other open source projects do that. So what they do is they call trigger error with a deprecation message and the type e-user deprecated, but they put the ampersand in front, the error suppression operator, which means, hey, if I run my tests now, I do not get that because, or I used to not get that with PHPUnit 10.1 because PHPUnit 1 ignored in its error handler everything that was suppressed, because I said, or at least I thought, hey, it's not PHPUnit's job to judge whether or not something should be suppressed. That is up to the developer that owns the code, owns the tests, runs the tests. Well, sometimes situations are really tricky, and you want to, in some situations, run the test and really ignore the error suppression operator and have that be triggered, but maybe not always. So running that test as is with PHPUnit 10.2 will give you the result. You'll see a green bar. There is no deprecation because the trigger error function call is suppressed using the error suppression operator. and you don't see a thing. But in your XML configuration file, you can now say, hey, ignore suppression of deprecations, ignore suppression of notices, ignore suppression of warnings. And then you will get the deprecation. Short side note, or short detour, if you will. Every e-deprecated, e-notice, e-strict, e-warning, whatever, will be emitted by the PHP runtime, even if you have configured in PHPUnit, or if you're using the error suppression operator, so that you do not see it, so that it's not reported, it will be emitted, which means that you have a very slight performance overhead when it comes to time, and an accumulative overhead when it comes to memory. And one of the, looking for the right adjective here, one of the most confusing slash fascinating, if you will, scary is what I was looking for. One of the scariest things that I've seen this year was a ticket that was opened for PHP itself. Some developer said, hey, I upgraded to the new version of PHP, and suddenly my PHP processes require 3 GB of memory. So this must be a performance regression in PHP, and this is awful, and go fix your shit, like people behave on the internet. Well, in that case, it was actually not that bad. But I don't know what to do. And then a couple of weeks later, the same person came back and said, oh, sorry, we fixed the deprecations in our code, and now we're down to 200 megabytes of memory, right? So and the thing that scares me is how many deprecations do you need to have in your code base that it takes a couple of gigabytes of memory. So not a situation I want to be in. So anyway, you now have, or you will have, come PHPUnit 10.2, full control, at least for now, I think so. We'll see how I think about that in a couple of weeks from now. Full control over how these deprecations, notices, warnings, whether they come from PHP itself, or whether they come from your code or from third-party code, whether they are suppressed or not suppressed, how they are interpreted, handled, and reported by PHPUnit. And hopefully this will make the lives of many developers better. Looking forward a bit, PHPUnit 10.3. To be honest, at this point, that's too far in the future for me to talk about what will be in there, what will not be in there. But I can tell you what we're currently working on. We are working on a new XML log file format for test results. Almost since the beginning of PHPUnit used the JUnit XML format for reporting test results. But the JUnit XML test result format is not owned by the PHPUnit project. Fun fact, it's also not owned by the JUnit project. Somebody came up with that format like 20 plus years ago when JUnit support was added to Apache End. And for the longest time, the Apache End project owned the JUnit XML format. Now it's somebody else. And a lot of different test framework communities took the same approach that PHPUnit did and just adopted JUnit XML, but the features are so different. PHPUnit has a lot of specific PHP-specific features that do not really fit into the JUnit XML format, and now we have so much telemetry information from the events that we would like to report so that you get an insight into where is memory used, when does the garbage collector run, how much memory does the garbage collector free, how long does the garbage collector run, and so on, while the tests are running, and that doesn't really fit into the JUnit XML format anymore. Plus, constant issues with the JUnit XML. You're doing this wrong. JUnit nowadays does this, yeah, but this doesn't really fit. So we want a format that we own. And yes, I know, insert xkcd, whatever here. Now we have n+1 standards, but our aim is not to have a standard, but to have a format that is specific to PHPUnit and makes sense to PHPUnit. And we're sure that there will be some great tools for reporting and things like that built on top of that new format that gives you access to all the information that PHP knows about your code, about your tests, about the results of running those tests, and so on. And I think that's it, which is good because I'm also running out of time. So I hope that this was useful, even though I did not really talk about fancy new features that help you write better tests. Instead, I brought you some, what some people might consider boring features for dealing with weird edge cases. But that's the life of a developer, right? Dealing with weird edge cases, and we rarely get to work with nice stuff where we do not cut ourselves on rough edges and deal with edge cases and so on. So I hope that this was still useful, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian.
One more thing, sorry.
Sorry.
I have stickers. They are PHPUnit stickers. Like in 2019, I finally thought, hey, it's time for PHPUnit to get a logo. So I asked my favorite board game graphics artist to design a logo for PHPUnit. And then I had stickers printed. And then for the next 2+ years, I did not go to any events where I could give out stickers for whatever weird reason. So I have stickers. Please feel free to take stickers.
Thank you. Right. Do we have any questions? Marco. Yeah, I knew it would be you.
Do I need to hide?
No. Thank you. It was a great talk. I would like to ask if it's possible to influence the exit code if the outcome is that the tests are passing, but there are some issues. I would like to know in the CI that I have deprecations, so I would like exit code, non-zero exit code.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is I need to look it up.
Okay. Sorry for giving you more work.
So one of the nice, sorry Marcus, one of the nice things that we now have as part of the big cleanup under the hood is that there is now a class inside PHPUnit that is called shell exit code calculator. And it gets as its input the result from all the tests, and it makes a decision based on that. Arne just volunteered to implement that.
So can you go back the definition of source and warnings?
This one?
Yes. So you are restricting warnings to this.
Yes.
Is there a way to catch? No. Yes, I know. It's probably no, but in vendor you may have library and you're using it wrong.
Yes.
Right. And the warning comes from there. So you're calling it, it's producing a warning. It's like kind of like one level in. Is there a way to do that? Does it need more work?
In theory, it would be possible. It's not possible right now. And I'm not sure how much more, not necessarily complicated, but how much more I want to add to that from a configuration perspective. So at the moment, it's this one element. This is the source. This is the code I'm interested in. And whatever is in there. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Any more questions? Nobody? Oh, there is one. Come on, George. You can take him now.
Can you do the opposite of restrict? I only want to like have notices in this code. Can you say, can I exclude the vendor and have like my warnings in every other bit of code?
That's exactly what this does.
Yeah, but I need to like define all of my vendor, like all of the folders I want to like care about. If yeah, well, if I care about having deprecation and test cases, I need to put like testing. Yeah, can
Yeah.
you exclude instead of include?
You can exclude from the include, which doesn't do what you want. You could include the root folder and exclude from there. That's a good point,
Okay,
Kieran.
yeah, that's smart. That's smart. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? So thank you, Sebastian. Round of applause.
Thank you.